Thank you very much, and I want to thank all the folks that are volunteering for RSS, because without them this would not be possible. I get my 45 minutes of fame once a year here at RSS. So good afternoon, everyone. I am Bob Adams. I am the lead cybersecurity engineer for iSecure here in Rochester, New York. A couple things. One, I'm going to try to keep this as informal as possible. I love to have folks raise their hand, ask questions. I like that spur of the moment type of activity. No question is a bad question. I want to be able to field as many of those as possible as we start to get through the process today. So 30-ish minutes, and we'll leave the rest for questions and answers. This is a topic that can be very muddy very quickly, so I just want to make sure that I'm able to answer a lot of folks' questions. This is one of the funniest things that I have seen in a long time as far as people's attitude about compliance, and I believe it's absolutely true that people would rather spend time with their mother-in-laws than talk about compliance and IT. But on the converse side, good compliance will absolutely outperform bad compliance every day of the week. So let's get right into it. What is a compliance framework? Set of standards that everybody lives and works by. Dependent on the industry, there's going to be different controls and standards in each one of those compliance or regulatory frameworks that you're working with. So the controls that you would find in HIPAA are going to be entirely different than they would be if you're working on CMMC. So there's four types of common frameworks. One is control-based. So if you have had the opportunity of doing any sort of SP 853 Rev 4 or Rev 5 compliance, there's a couple of nuances that get involved with that. One is if you go into the Department of Homeland Security and you download what's called the CSET tool, C-S-E-T, it's going to actually ask you some very important questions when you start a compliance assessment with their tool. One is called SAL, or Security Assurance Level, and that is based on the criticality of the environment that you're working in. So a nuclear power plant has a much higher level of criticality than, let's say, a small pharmacy. But they all have the same need for a lot of these similar controls. DHS has 18 defined categories, so that could be anywhere from nuclear power plants to financial to healthcare to industrial. It runs the gamut. So there's probably a category that you will fit into if you want to utilize this type of approach. The second is going to be program-based. So if you're looking at a lot of organizations that may be originally European-based, or in some cases, we see this a lot with financial organizations, they're using ISO 27001. You'll find the controls sitting in Annex A. And again, it's a pretty straightforward compliance framework that you can utilize, and it makes, a relatively straightforward process. The next is going to be risk-based, and this is probably the one that most people are familiar with. How many have used the NIST cybersecurity framework in their, wow, literally everybody. So that's a good thing. So have you, a show of hands, just real quick. How many folks are in the healthcare industry? How many are in legal? How many are in finance? Oh man, you guys own this room. How many would be more of a traditional corporate environment where you have, just a normal, type of environment? Okay. The next is going to be compliance-based. So we sort of alluded to this already. HIPAA is one of those compliance-based frameworks that has a lot of meat to it. When I first got started in the cybersecurity and compliance industry, I was working for a large healthcare system here in Rochester, and I had been on the job maybe 6 months or so, and the VP of IT walked in and dropped this huge pile of paperwork on my desk, and he goes, "Congratulations, you're now our HIPAA compliance engineer." And that was the year 2000. And there was literally no information about what it was, what it did, what the implications were. But the scuttlebutt was that if you did this poorly, you could be fined, you could be arrested. There was a whole lot of conjecture that went along with it. I would have to say that a lot of that has never really come to fruition, but it is a highly, viewed compliance or regulatory need. So why do we have compliance? We have an enormous amount of pressure and scrutiny placed on our organizations to comply. And it's a growing issue for almost everyone. So it used to be you may have one or two compliance networks or compliance frameworks. Now, if you are in healthcare, you may have HIPAA. You may have, if you're located in New York State Shield Act. You may be managing people's money. So now the Department of Financial Services, NYS DFS, Section 23 RR 500. You may have NIST. You may have several other compliance or regulatory needs based on what you're doing. Healthcare, a logical extension there is that you may be a teaching hospital. You may have a school or medical school of education. And now, if you are actually getting government dollars for doing research that you've done inside of this particular environment, now you have FSMA. So it just gets layered on, and you will lose control very quickly. So increased framework scrutiny, absolutely. Things that are driving our industry right now, data breaches. The thing that I think every client that I talk to right now is, we're getting ready to renew our cybersecurity liability insurance, and we're not really sure where we stand. So by utilizing a well-known, vetted compliance framework, you have a much higher likelihood of maintaining your coverage. You have a much higher likelihood of keeping a competitive rate, and you probably are going to be in a much better place from a technology and security perspective. So healthcare, let's talk about, I did very quickly. So healthcare, HIPAA, you have high tech. Those are going to be a couple of the major players. NIST, cybersecurity framework, New York State Shield Act, New York State Department of Financial Services. The big bonus here is, and I don't know how New York State did this, they actually came up with the fact that they're going to use the NIST cybersecurity framework for those two regulatory requirements. So if you are prescriptively abiding by the NIST cybersecurity framework, you will be grandfathered in for the Department of Financial Services and the New York State Shield Act. So that's a win and a bonus. PCI DSS, the payment card industry, it's a totally different beast. It has its own set of controls, but there are some that do align, and you want to make sure that you leverage that information. Higher ed. This is turning into a hot mess for a lot of folks. So you have HIPAA, because you may have on-campus healthcare where they're actually providing some of that information. It's not really truly HIPAA because you're not a healthcare provider in the distinct sense. You have FSMA. You're going to have FINRA because you now are talking about managing money that's going to be coming forward for student services, student payments, FERPA, GLBA, FTC. How many have had to deal with GLBA at this point? So how's that going? So we have seen instances where GLBA is actually extending into environments that you would never expect. So colleges actually have a requirement to meet GLBA with FTC enforcement. Car dealerships actually have a GLBA component, surprisingly enough. And they can be all assessed and reviewed through the FTC. One of the things that, have I? Thank you. Yep. I guess I was punching the wrong button. So, yeah, I advanced way quicker than I thought. So higher education, there's a lot of different dependencies there. When we get through K through 12, it's a little bit more modest. You know, Ed Law 2D is going to be driving a lot of those requirements, but they still are going to have a lot of the same NIST requirements that we see, simply because of the fact that everybody wants to be on an equal playing field. A lot of these particular compliance and regulatory needs have a lot of commonality, and that's where we're going to be driving this today. So financial banking, another one with just an extraordinary amount of requirements. FFIEC has roughly 400-ish declarative statements, but if you were to take and map those to the NIST cybersecurity framework, so there's roughly 110 in NIST, but it maps to almost 200 in FFIEC, which is a big win because now you've actually done less work prescriptively and you've ended up with a lot more coverage for that particular compliance or regulatory need. NCUA, same thing, falls under the auspices of FFIEC, makes it a no-brainer if you are in the financial industry and you are a national credit union. Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, fin services, it's a very important thing to maintain and observe. FERPA, if that bank is doing work for a higher ed organization, they may have to be prescriptive to that as well. So there's a lot of things that go into that. ISO 27001, PCI DSS, Sarbanes-Oxley. So you can start to see that there's a lot of crush and a lot of convergence that's occurring. So the other component is going to be somewhat non-traditional for a lot of folks here. It's going to be your ICS SCADA environments. They're going to be looking, if you're in a critical infrastructure, NIST SP 853. You may be looking at some of the compliance support that comes through SP 882. And then the big one that everybody gets really uptight about is NERC and SIP. But again, a lot of that can be applied through the extended SP 853 Rev 5 controls that you'd find inside the CSET tool. CMMC, which is nothing more than SP 800 171 and 172 for levels 2 and 3. So you can start to see that there's a lot of commonality for a lot of these controls and how they all dovetail together. So cloud and online retail, very similar set of requirements and concerns. PCI DSS, almost every website is going to have some sort of transactional activity in order to render those goods and services. The one that I'm still surprised, there are organizations out there that are dealing with other people's data, dealing with their confidential information, their intellectual property, and don't have a SOC 2 Type 2 attestation in place. FedRAMP, again, another one of those controls that you may need to explore. GDPR pretty much set the precedent for almost every Consumer Data Protection Act that has originated in the US. When California got on board with CCPA, the initial legislation for that was very convoluted. They had passed the initial CCPA law set, and within months, they were actually making revisions and changes to the initial set of requirements. And they actually went through an evolutionary process for probably close to 18 months before they finally got a good fit. Once the novelty had worn off, other states have started to embrace the metric and the performance that the CCPA guidelines provided. The one problem that we will have moving forward, how many companies, individuals here deal with multiple states right now? Okay, so if you have customers, if you're located in New York State and you have customers in California, you're on CCPA. If you are in any of the other adjacent states, and there's 7 or 8 that have gotten to this point, you have to meet their guidelines for their Consumer Protection Act. So we have 50 states. So we could end up with 50 different sets of criteria for that Consumer Protection Act based state by state. My premise is that at some point, we are going to end up with a federal statute that's going to make this level of compliance and integration much, much simpler. When I talk to organizations who have a compliance need, they are looking at how to manage their governance risk and compliance overall, and I talk to the in-house counsel, they're like, yeah, about that. We have 50 different data breach notification requirements. We have potentially 50 different consumer protection acts that we're going to have to deal with. We need to figure out a way to unify those controls, those protective requirements, and make sure that everything is working appropriately and not waste your time and effort and money to make sure that the compliance is working properly. So, pressures that we have, budgets, what I call critical success factors. So there's a whole bunch of them. One is the staff that you have natively right now. Do they have the appropriate skill sets to manage or help to implement a compliance framework? Do they have the working knowledge? Do they have the skill sets that accompany that? Do they need future training in order to make that particular process successful? You have the appropriate tools and technology that is going to help move your compliance initiative forward, whether it be an in-house developed program. It could be as rudimentary as an Excel spreadsheet, to start to build out your requirements and needs. Or you could make something more sophisticated. There's third-party tools out there that you can utilize commercially that will also help you with your compliance requirements and initiatives. Process, culture, two very important aspects of getting compliance integrated into your organization. If you don't have the necessary support from your executive and C-level suite members, you're probably going to have a very difficult time in getting the compliance programs to where you feel they should be to a certain level of maturity. One of the things that I see is that a lot of organizations do their compliance on an annual basis. It means they update everything, they do everything, and then they sort of let it languish during the course of the year. So it's not really supposed to work that way. It should be something of continuous improvement throughout the year. As the risks change, as the laws change, as the requirements and needs of the organization change, those compliance initiatives, those compliance controls need to be updated and refined. It's a very simple process, but it requires time and investment. So one of the things that people get concerned about, which compliance frameworks are going to be mandatory. If you are in healthcare, HIPAA compliance is going to be mandatory. If you are in financial industry, FFIEC is going to be mandatory. There are fines and prescriptive penalties that are accompanied with that. One of the things that I get concerned about when I see folks that are working on these types of approaches is they want to go all in. They want to do everything all at once. And I'm going to tell you that the simplest approach is to make it attainable and sustainable. Start with small chunks, things that actually have the highest level of risk for you. So one of the things that we do during our process is we'll do a vulnerability assessment. We're going to look at Active Directory. We're going to look at your Azure AD. We're going to be looking at your endpoint maturity and protection. We're going to be looking at architecture. We're going to be looking at your firewalls, Wi-Fi. And we're actually building out an inventory of gaps. Does that gap meet, does it define an area where you need to meet a higher level of proficiency or security? That is very, very important. One of the things that we also find is that organizations tend to focus on what they're the most comfortable with. I would encourage everybody to step outside their comfort zone and go for the things that you have the least amount of knowledge with first. Sometimes getting that hurdle accomplished is going to be very important. It gives you a sense of accomplishment. You know, hey, I did the tough part first. Now I can go on to some of the easier stuff. So crosswalking is pretty simple. So if you look at NIST Cybersecurity Framework, version 1.1, you have 5 functions. You have basically 22 control families and about 108-ish controls. And they are fairly prescriptive in nature. That microphone must be still on. They're fairly prescriptive in nature, but one of the things that is what makes it easy is that you can actually see what the remediation activities are for a lot of those from a prescriptive nature. So I would invite everybody to go and download the NIST Cybersecurity Framework control set. There's actually an alignment that will help you map it to other controls as well. The NIST site is very, very comprehensive. There's way more material than you will ever be able to digest, so you have to pick your battles carefully. So NIST Cybersecurity Framework 1.1 is going to be an important activity, just so that you get a good foundational aspect. If you are already using this cybersecurity framework, you're probably going to want to make sure that those controls extend and align to other compliance frameworks that may be important. And there are tools and techniques and resources out on the web that will help aid you in that journey. So the big thing is reducing the amount of effort. You know, leverage and duplication, that's going to be a huge issue for a lot of organizations. Do I have enough resources to actually accomplish all of these activities and all of the work that needs to be done? If you're able to reduce the number of redundant entries, now you have you know, a much more complete crosswalk across all these different compliance and control frameworks. So at some point, you're going to have to go back and say, we need to do this. How do you sell this? How do you make this pitch to your senior leadership or you know, your peers inside the organization? Multiple frameworks, you have less lift. You are not going to be doing the same thing over and over again. It's not going to be like Groundhog Day. You're going to have the ability to take that one control, park it into one, and have it extend all the way across all of their multiple compliance and regulatory frameworks. Knowing that you have a really good alignment gives you a boost in your confidence that you are able to provide a good response or a, you know, if you have an audit, you can show your due diligence, you can show that you're meeting these particular controls and you're doing it in a consistent and diligent fashion. The big thing that we always see when we start to do a NIST version 1.1 gap analysis is we're gathering a whole bunch of information. So the first thing, if you were my client, I'm going to ask, I want all of your policies and procedures. And some people will go, great, here's everything. I'll put it up on a OneDrive share and you can have at it. And typically we find for most organizations that a lot of information is still tribal. There's an incomplete set of policies and procedures. If you are actually able to take all of the controls and map the policies and procedures that would be assigned to each one of those, or collectively, you would probably end up with between 40 and 50 different policies and procedures that would be prescriptively addressing all of those controls. So some organizations prefer to have a separate policy and procedure for each control or activity or group. Some like to make it a composite. They create a playbook or a runbook of their compliance, and they group them by chapter, by a unique identifier, but it can be large and it can be numerous. So when I am looking at some of this stuff, I may have to go through 20, 30, 40 policies to understand the maturity of that company. The big ones that I think anybody who is put into a compliance or governance, role is having an information security plan, having an incident response plan, having a business continuation disaster recovery plan. Things that I would also suggest that you do is actually go through a business impact analysis to determine some of the more key or weak spots where you may need to bolster your compliance or your investment into cybersecurity. One of the things that I always find when we're going through this type of exercise is that we end up with a fairly good, accurate idea of where their strengths and their weaknesses are. When doing so, you now have to engage or have a prescriptive element or remediation to go with it. Larger organizations sometimes can be more agile. They have more money, they have more people, they can assign very specific tasks and get it done. We have one client, Bulk Energy, 700 locations, publicly traded, all of the requirements that you can possibly think of. The first year that we engaged them, they were not very good at all, surprisingly enough. They had a very poor incident response plan, despite the fact that they had an enormously large amount of distributed risk inside their organization. They had 1 million+ customers that if there was a problem with their process or something went down, they would be in real trouble. One of the first things that we came back with is you need to really ramp up your incident response plan. They dedicated a full-time engineer for a year and actually produced probably one of the best incident response plans I've seen to date. It was not small, but it covered literally every particular nuance that you can think of from a business continuation plan. So they addressed all of their cybersecurity needs. They addressed all of the communication that needed to be addressed for their customer base, making sure that all of the information that needed to be disseminated publicly was addressed. One of the things that we see inside any response like this is, you have to protect the financial component, the functional component, and the reputational component of your organization. And by having the appropriate policies and procedures, having the appropriate compliance in place, your level of success is going to be much higher. And I think that that is something that people need to understand. Once you start the compliance process, you sort of get into a groove. You sort of understand, what is expected of me or my team or outside services that is going to be helping me with this. And there will always be need for third-party expertise. So if you're good with doing NIST Cybersecurity Framework version 1.1, you're doing a lot of HIPAA, but you have other needs. Let's say you're a higher ed, educational, and research-based healthcare system. You may not have a clue what's going to be required to do FISMA. So you probably want to look at pulling somebody in that's going to provide you with the appropriate level of expertise and help you close a lot of those gaps as you start to lay out your compliance alignment. So best practices. Identify the common controls that you need across all the applicable frameworks. So you can actually make a one-to-one-to-one alignment for a lot of those and go, well, if I do my identity and access management, I'm going to knock all of these off of all 5 of my compliance and regulatory needs. Check, done. I don't recommend using a compliance framework as a checkbox exercise because you have to have skin in the game. You have to have the evidentiary components that support and make sure that you actually can prove what you say you have done inside of your compliance documentation. You're able to add an additional compliance framework. Let's say your business model changes and you have to add something. You've already done 90% of the work. You're just going to build out that alignment, show your pre-existing controls, and you're probably going to save a lot of time, money, and anguish just by getting that done in a simple and inventorial-based approach. One of the things that comes out of any sort of vulnerability and compliance analysis is the gap analysis, where your maturity lies. So when we use the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, we actually build out the 22 unique control groups, and we provide a certain level of scoring that goes with each. So a lot of companies really don't have an idea of how that works. So metrics. So if you have literally nothing for your policies and procedures, everything is tribal, or you have very little documentation, especially around those key critical documents. We set up a scoring rubric based on 0 to 5. 5 being the best, 0 being totally non-existent. I would hazard a guess that most organizations are going to have some formal documentation, but there's going to be a lot of tribal information that's handed from one individual to the next, especially when it's a team-based activity. And now you start to understand what your real security and compliance posture is going to be. So if you score a 1 on your policies and your procedures, so the policy being what is expected of that particular control or activity inside your organization, and the procedure that executes it. If you have a 1, that means that you're probably not doing a very good job. It's predominantly tribal in nature. You probably haven't had a formal document or updated it in several years. If you score a 2, for instance, now the metrics are starting to collapse a little bit. You may have reviewed or created that policy in the last 2 years, but it's still not up to date. And where a lot of companies struggle is how well are we actually enforcing those policies? How well are we doing to enforce that particular compliance or regulatory need? So now from the procedural aspect, if you deviate from that, let's say 10%. So if you are tracking help desk calls for password updates or changes, and people are complaining that 8 characters is too many, but your minimum acceptable character string length is 12, you're probably not going to want, to say that that policy and that procedure is successful. The other corresponding thing is that as you get higher in a higher degree of scoring, the amount of wiggle room is going to drop dramatically. I would state unequivocally that most organizations never hit a 3 out of the gate. After a couple of years, they probably are hitting a 3 across the 22 controls on 70% of those. I've had one customer who has hit a 3 across almost every control, and they're like, well, how much more is it going to take for us to get to a 4? And I said, it's going to take an enormous amount of time, effort, and commitment to do that. And it's very unlikely that you're going to hit a 4 across everything. A 4 would probably be less than a 2% deviation on how you manage your documentation and process, and how do you track that information. It becomes much more granular. So one of the things that I always stress to people is continuously monitor and maintain your compliance with a plan. You have to have a plan that's going to work every day. It's not something that you just pick up and drop off and start it again in 6 months. It needs to be continuous refinement. Make it attainable and sustainable. One of the things that when I'm dealing with higher ed, a couple of years ago, we saw an enormous amount of influx that New York State was going to make everybody mandatory for NIST SB 853 Rev 5, and the goals were going to be fundamentally unattainable because they didn't have the financial resources, they didn't have the staff. Most of them didn't even know what they were getting themselves into. And I said, stop. You need to actually back up and make this a lot simpler for yourself. If you have 450 controls, you're probably not going to see the end of it. It's not going to be successful. But if you take the NIST cybersecurity framework and you couple that with something like the CIS version 8 controls library, you can actually achieve a much higher level of success because now you've combined 2 different compliance frameworks that have a certain level or difference in focus, and where one may get you to 40%, the other may get you to 45 or 50%, but the controls may be different, and you end up with a fundamental improvement where you're actually seeing a 70% level of compliance, and that's important. Understanding how you can leverage some of these compliance tools and resources to provide that composite that you need. Being somewhat of a nerd, a geek, I love the red team and the blue team activities, doing the scanning, all the cool, glamorous stuff. But when the rubber hits the road, compliance is really the ultimate indicator of how robust an organization is, how well their security posture is being maintained, how much time and effort they're spending on those reoccurring changes within the industry. And with 5, 6, 7 or more different compliance or regulatory frameworks, some people will call it a burden. You want to be able to leverage all of those controls in a very straightforward, simple approach. And I think that allows you to sleep at night. When I interview C-level suite members, the question that I ask is, so what's that one nagging thing that keeps you up at night? It's usually not compliance. It's usually some sort of risk-based threat actor activity. So I'm worried about ransomware. Well, are you doing everything inside of your compliance and regulatory frameworks that would reduce that particular risk vector, for ransomware? And if you have a well thought out incident response plan that actually touches on a lot of those controls, you're probably going to be much more resilient than a company that does not. And that is a key takeaway. It will let you sleep at night. I find a certain amount of nerd joy in doing the compliance alignments and the regulatory components because they're all different. Every company is going to be different. And that, agility for each company is what's going to make, every situation different and a little bit of a challenge. So you have to figure out what your predominant compliance and regulatory needs are going to be. So, probably can't see this. So this is very simply a snapshot of my 10,000-foot view of NIST cybersecurity framework on the left-hand side. And then I have done the 22 control groups across. So you'll see that I did it for healthcare, I did it for financial services, I did it for the New York State SHIELD Act, I did it for the credit card payment industry, I did it for education, and there's another 15 that go across the other side of this document. But the point is that if you look at the amount of success that you can have by starting with the appropriate foundational compliance framework, if you were able to see this, that almost all of those controls align specifically with other compliance frameworks. And that is a key takeaway. So where is compliance taking us next? Will AI fit into the compliance picture? Absolutely. Right now I can tell you that it's woefully inaccurate. If you ask ChatGPT to do anything remotely close to a compliance or some sort of compliance initiative, the answers are 80% of the time wrong. It has little or no awareness from 2001 forward, which means that all of the current legislation, all of the updated regulatory requirements and frameworks are not even existent there. So heed that as a warning. Data privacy is going to be the next big thing that drives almost all of our compliance initiatives. When you see the number of states that are adopting a consumer protection act of some sort, protecting your data, that is going to change the performance and the metrics of a lot of these compliance frameworks and the specific controls inside of it. The one that everybody is, very concerned about, over the last year, I think I've done 7 or 8 reviews for good-sized organizations who have given me the copy of their cybersecurity technology review. 3 years ago, it was 2 pages. 3 years ago, it was up to 4. This last year, most of them were hovering around 10. And it wasn't just the simple stuff. They wanted to know, if you're in a healthcare environment, how many records do you actually maintain or try to protect? So, they started with 50,000, and I can tell you that for some of my customers, it's literally tens of millions of lines. So that amplifies the necessity for data loss protection and all the compliance and regulatory things that go with that. Breaches are going to occur. How many folks here use or follow like Attack.io, where you get announcements on a daily basis? Anybody? I use Attack.io just as a news feed, and I would have to say that I get 6 to 8 announcements every day for a large organization that has been breached. and some of them are fairly simple attack vectors that if they'd actually been doing their compliance appropriately, they probably would not be suffering that breach right now or that incident. The Consumer Protection Act, we've got 50 states. I want to see, write your congressman, write your senator, tell them we need one unified, federal act so that we only have to deal with this once rather than 50 times. So things that are happening soon. NIST earlier in the year submitted requests for what changes should be made to the NIST cybersecurity framework. And we've been living with version 1.1 for several years. They've now made the decision that it needs to be updated and refined. So where we originally had 5 controls or 5 control families, we will now have 6. They're adding one for governance. So a lot of that information that was sort of alluded to in some of the other control groups and control families has now been moved to governance. They've added additional controls to reflect that additional need for governance. It's going to change how everybody does their crosswalks and their control alignments starting probably around the second quarter of 2024. That means for guys like me, I have to rewrite and reorganize all of my compliance and framework and alignments that I have and I've been working with over the last few years. I think it's an excellent idea that they add governance. When they went from version 1.1 to 1.11, they added a lot of risk-based model activity into the NIST cybersecurity framework, and I thought that made a huge difference for a lot of organizations. If you are doing anything with the federal government where you have CMMC, it became a federal mandate that you had to be prescriptive to CMMC level 2, which was the NIST SP 800 181, or excuse me, 171 and 172 if you went to a level 3. If you didn't have that attestation in place, you couldn't do business with the federal government anymore. I expect that that's going to be more of a normal activity. If you have activities that surround FISMA, the normal process there is that you build out your security attestation. You can't do business, you can't collect money, you can't do anything with that intellectual property or product until you receive what's called an ATO, or authority to operate, from the federal government. My expectation is we're going to see a lot more of that, industry by industry, where just sending out a risk analysis sheet to a new client or a new vendor is not going to be sufficient enough. It's going to be much more binding long term. So I want to open it up for questions because I'm hopeful that this has spawned some questions for folks. Anyone? Yes, sir. So you're obviously a ISACA guy. Okay, so COBIT is another one of those control families. And again, COBIT is one of those products that has a lot of consistency across other frameworks as well. I don't see as many organizations embracing COBIT versus some of the others. Right. Yeah. One of the things that I see for a lot of organizations is they're going to go with a governmental standard. NIST has spent literally tens of millions of dollars to develop and refine these particular frameworks dependent on the industry, and they've become an accepted standard. I actually see a lot of organizations in Canada using the NIST standards rather than ISO 27001. It has a lot of meat to it, and it's well detailed, well thought out, and the organization as a whole does a very good job of managing the compliance frameworks. I mean, if you're going to look at NIST as your de facto standard resource, things that I would tell you to look at would be SP 830 for risk management, SP 833. If you're doing HIPAA, it would be 866. There's a lot of really good information in there. If you are doing more traditional corporate functionality, NIST cybersecurity framework is going to be your foundational tool. It's going to give you a lot of the activities and controls that you need to adequately secure and make sure that your company is going to be resilient in the face of a cyber attack or a functional issue. If you are really concerned about your organization's security posture, SP 853 Rev 5 is going to be where you're going to go. And you're going to want to calculate your security assurance level, which is going to define how many of those controls will actually be active. So, if you have a security assurance level of low, it's probably going to be right around 400. If you are medium, it's probably going to be right around 750 to 780. You get to high, you're just on the cusp of 1,000, and critical takes you well over 1,000 controls. That is a daunting task. I would not wish that on anyone. I had to do that exact process for a genome sequencing supercomputer for FSMA and for HIPAA. And the amount of detail and evidentiary stuff that goes with that was absolutely enormous. And it's hard to comprehend how much time that takes. So keeping it to that model of sustainable and attainable is going to be very important for you. Small chunks. Start with something that will give you a good idea of what your barometer is, where you need to go next in order to make sure that you're going to be able to complete some of this stuff. The worst thing I can imagine would be an incomplete compliance framework. Yep, I have 2 minutes. So, other questions? Thank you for that. Anyone? Yes? Yes.
What kind of scenarios do you expect to see?
Well, I mean,
Besides, of course,
well, let's take that a step further. So, the breach may be the catalyst for other things that happen. So, and financial is a unique beast. So let's say you suffer a data incident or data breach. You've had to make the appropriate notification to the Attorney State General and tell them that we've suffered a breach. Now it's public. Now it's not just the resiliency and the technical controls that you're exercising to protect your data, your client data, your fiscal data, but now you have a reputational component. So you've seen it already happen this last year where organizations voted with their wallet and there was a run on deposits for that particular financial organization. If you have a huge breach, I'm going to want to get my money out of there as quickly as possible. So now you have a financial impact. You may not have enough fiscal reserves inside your organization to accommodate that run on deposits. Now you have to borrow it. Now you've incurred additional debt. You have additional business issues that are going to impact the livelihood and the longevity of that organization. And that can extend to anything. So if you have a unique product and you're in a industrial control environment and your product is, the intellectual property is stolen, you have nothing to sell anymore. There was a very interesting article on 60 Minutes where a Chinese organization had stolen all of the intellectual property for a company based out of Massachusetts, the American Semiconductor Company. And they did nothing but technology for windmills, for wind power generation. They stole it. There was a loss of 700 jobs and hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. I think they put close to $700 million in loss. And that was just because somebody stole something. It wasn't a denial of service attack. It wasn't a ransomware attack. All they did was exfiltrate the data and move it over to a company that has fundamentally no patent protection, no intellectual rights protection. And now you have a huge problem. And unfortunately, that company was caught. They were fined heavily, and because of some other mitigating circumstances, that company has now disappeared, but that intellectual property is still out there. Next question. Anybody? Okay. If you have further questions, I'll be around the balance of today. I'll be around tomorrow. I have business cards up at the front, so if you'd like it, my contact information, you're more than welcome to it.